Please be aware, in this podcast series we talk about all areas of safeguarding, which some people may find upsetting. So please make sure you're okay listening to today's topic. Be mindful of those around you, such as children, that you might not want to listen in. Hi, I'm SSS Safeguarding Director Sam Preston.
And I'm former head teacher and content author Sarah Spinks.
Today we're looking into the complex world of data protection and focusing on the UK GDPR, particularly how it applies to schools. So it's data protection. It can sound like a bit of a minefield. So I think let's start with the basics, Sarah. Can we just outline exactly what the UK GDPR is and how does it differ from the EU GDPR?
Well, that's a great place to start. So GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, is a European Union law that governs how personal data is collected, stored and used. When the UK was part of the EU, it followed these rules directly.
Yeah, but after Brexit, the UK introduced its own version, if you like, which we now call the UK GDPR. So whilst it's heavily based, isn't it, on the EU version, there are some key differences that schools and other organisations need to be aware of. So, Sarah, it might be useful to outline the differences and consider if UK GDPR is trickier to manage.
Well, UK GDPR is not trickier necessarily, but definitely something schools need to keep an eye on. For example, one big difference is the enforcement body. So in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO, it's often termed as, enforces data protection laws, while the European Data Protection Board handles it in the EU. So there are also slight differences in fines and how international data transfers are managed.
Yeah, so speaking of fines, those can get really pretty hefty, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the UK, the ICO can impose fines of up to 17.5 million. Or 4% of a school's global turnover, whichever is higher. So for serious breaches, that is. So taking compliance seriously is definitely in the school's best interest.
Absolutely. That is a lot of money. So we have to get this right, don't we? So let's look at the day-to-day operations in schools, because whenever you're working in schools, they are, what do I need to do is always the thing, isn't it? So,
absolutely.
So what do schools need to be mindful of regarding GDPR compliance?
Well, schools deal with a lot of personal data, everything from names and addresses to academic records and even medical information. So under UK GDPR, schools need to ensure they're only collecting data that's necessary for their operations.
Yeah, and that's something that's often under that term, and I think sometimes it's not really well understood, what we call data minimization.
That's right, Sam, yeah.
And you do have to think, do I need to hold this data and do I need to keep this data, isn't it?
That's right, Sam, yeah. They also need the right security measures in place, like encryption and access controls, and that then protects that data from any unauthorized access.
So it's not just collecting less data, it's also about protecting it better?
Absolutely, yeah. And if there's ever a data breach, schools must notify the ICO and the affected individuals, as soon as possible. And there's no room for delay. And this is where having proper procedures in place really helps.
Yeah, and this is something we have seen schools targeted, and because they have such a wealth of data that they store. And I know that data breaches are something that we all worry about that, but particularly schools really, really worry about. So I'm just thinking, what about consent? How does that play into all of this?
Well, consent's a huge part of GDPR. Schools must get explicit consent from parents, students or staff before collecting and processing their personal data. And this is especially important when dealing with those sensitive information data, things like health or biometric data, for example. Right. Schools must also ensure that they're informing individuals about what they're doing with their data and why they're collecting it and for how long they'll keep it.
Yeah, so that brings us to retention, which is another thing that I know schools are always sort of a little bit uncertain about. Is there anything specific to schools when it comes to data retention?
Yes, and that's another key area. So schools need clear policies on how long they retain data. For example, they shouldn't only keep data for as long as it's necessary for the purposes it was collected for, such as maintaining academic records or dealing with safeguarding issues.
So once the data is no longer needed, it should be securely deleted, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
You mentioned international data transfers earlier. If a school is working with students who live in EU countries or use overseas data storage, does that affect them?
It can. So schools must ensure that any personal data transferred outside the UK, especially to countries that don't have equivalent data protection laws, that needs to be properly safeguarded. And this often involves using mechanisms like standard contractual clauses to uphold data protection standards.
Sounds like there's a lot to juggle there. What's your advice for schools trying to stay compliant with UK GDPR?
Well, the key is to have a comprehensive data protection policy and regularly review it. Schools, they should train staff on GDPR and data protection practices. They conduct privacy impact assessments when necessary and ensure that they're staying up to date with any changes in the law. It's not just about avoiding fines. It's about protecting the privacy of students and staff.
And that, I imagine, is particularly important when we're dealing with younger pupils.
Yeah, definitely. Schools also need to be aware of the age of consent for data processing. In the UK, that age is 13, but this can vary in different countries. So international schools need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So lots of moving points we've touched on. It's been really insightful. Thanks, Sarah, for doing that breakdown. Just to finish, listeners, if you're involved in education and you want to ensure your school's up to speed on data protection, make sure you get your policy and procedures in place. Make sure all staff understand the GDPR basics. That's really crucial. Everybody needs to understand those basics. You can always check out, we've got information on the SSS Learning website. We've got lots of supportive stuff up there and articles. But we've also got our online UK GDPR course as well, which is a really good baseline introduction.